hook. Imagine a man who spent his entire life asking questions, only to conclude that he ultimately had no definitive answers. He was declared the wisest man in all of Athens by a divine oracle, yet that very same city, the cradle of democracy, would later condemn him to die by poison. This isn't a paradox from some forgotten mythical text. It is the true historical account of Socrates. And the moment one truly grasps why he willingly, even calmly, accepted that cup of hemlock is the moment one's own most deeply held certainties might begin to fracture. Intro. We live in an age of declarative statements and feigned expertise, a time when admitting uncertainty can often feel like a sign of weakness. In the sun-scorched, marble-adorned world of 5th century Athens, one man, often seen barefoot, always in a simple, rumpled tunic, made a profound virtue of the exact opposite. His simple admission, "I know that I know nothing," was not an end to conversation, but a radical beginning. It was an intellectual scalpel, a phrase so powerful and so disruptive to the established order that it ultimately led him to a dramatic trial for his life. The verdict brought an end to his time on earth, but it forever altered the course of Western thought. The city that loved words. To understand Socrates, one must first understand his city, Athens in its golden age. Picture the Athenian agora on a bustling market day, sunlight gleaming off the marble of the Parthenon and the other temples on the Acropolis high above, the air thick with the scent of olives, wine, and baking bread, the constant hum of merchants haggling, and the passionate, animated sound of citizens engaged in fierce public debate. This was the heart of a city that had invented the concept of democracy, a place where words and arguments were the primary currency of power. But this golden city was also a city bearing deep psychological scars. It was staggering from the utter devastation of the nearly 3-decade-long Peloponnesian War. A brutal plague had wiped out nearly a third of its population. Its final humiliating defeat at the hands of its rival, Sparta, led to the dismantling of its democratic institutions and the installation of a cruel, Spartan-backed oligarchy known as the 30 Tyrants. Led by the ruthless Critias, this regime unleashed a reign of terror, executing around 1,500 citizens without trial and seizing their property. Though democracy was eventually restored after only 8 months, it was a fragile, paranoid version of its former self. The city was jumpy, still reeling from civil strife, and radical questions could easily be mistaken for subversion, even treason. It was in this tense, supercharged atmosphere that Socrates, a man from a humble background, a stonemason by trade, son of a midwife but also a decorated and famously brave hoplite soldier, began his singular mission. He would walk through the market stalls, not to buy or sell goods, but to engage his fellow citizens, powerful generals, ambitious politicians, and celebrated poets, asking them to define the very virtues they so confidently claimed to embody. The bombshell at Delphi. The story of Socrates' very public life begins not in the clamor of the Athenian agora, but on the misty slopes of Mount Parnassus, at the sacred site of Delphi. For centuries, Greeks from every corner of the known world, from kings planning invasions to commoners making life decisions, made the arduous pilgrimage to the Temple of Apollo to consult its famous oracle. The oracle, a high priestess known as the Pythia, was believed to channel the cryptic words of the god Apollo himself, offering guidance on matters of state, war, and personal destiny. Sometime before he began his public questioning, Socrates' enthusiastic friend and admirer, Chaerephon, traveled to this sacred place and posed a simple, direct question to the Pythia. Is anyone wiser than Socrates? The answer that came back was equally simple and startling: no. When news of this divine pronouncement reached Athens, it was met with astonishment, none more so than by Socrates himself. He was, by his own account, acutely and painfully aware of his own ignorance. Believing the god could not possibly lie, yet unable to accept the claim at face value, He concluded that the oracle must be a riddle. He resolved to solve it. The only way he could do this was to set out to find someone in Athens wiser than himself, and, in so doing, prove the oracle wrong. The city, unknowingly, was about to become his personal laboratory, and its most prominent citizens his test subjects. Street interrogations. With his divine mission now set, Socrates began his systematic interrogations of Athens' most respected citizens. He would approach a celebrated general, a man like Laches, who was renowned for his battlefield exploits, and ask him to define the virtue of courage. The general, confident in his expertise, might offer a conventional answer, such as, "Courage is a man who holds his post in battle." Socrates would then gently introduce a counterexample. What of armies that use strategic retreat as a tactic to win, like the Scythians? With a few more pointed questions, he would show that endurance of the soul isn't always wise, and therefore can't be courage. The general's definition, and his confident assurance, would begin to unravel. Socrates performed the same intellectual surgery on poets, asking them to explain their own inspired verses, only to find they could not articulate the deeper wisdom their own words contained. He questioned politicians about the nature of justice and craftsmen about the definition of beauty. A famous encounter was with a young man named Euthyphro, who was on his way to prosecute his own father for impiety. Socrates, himself facing a charge of impiety, asked Euthyphro to define piety. Euthyphro first said piety is what he was doing, and then defined it as that which is dear to the gods. Socrates masterfully showed that since the gods disagree and quarrel, the same action could be both dear to some gods and hated by others, making the definition useless. In every instance, the result was the same. His interlocutors, who began their conversations with the absolute certainty of experts, were reduced to a state of confused perplexity, a condition the Greeks called aporia and impasse. Socrates concluded that the oracle was correct, but in a subtle, ironic way. His own wisdom lay not in believing he had answers, but in being acutely aware that he had none. The person who recognizes and admits their own ignorance is, in fact, wiser than the one who falsely believes they possess knowledge they do not have. The method behind the madness. Socrates himself wrote nothing down, but his brilliant student Plato immortalized his unique technique in a series of dialogues. Socrates called his method maieutics, or intellectual midwifery, a trade he said he learned from his mother. A midwife, he reasoned, does not create a child. She simply assists in the delivery of something that is already there, waiting to be born. Similarly, Socrates believed his questions did not implant new ideas into his listeners, but rather helped his conversation partners give birth to the understanding, or more often, the lack of it that lay dormant within them. This process, known as the relentless, was a rigorous, cooperative form of cross-examination. It typically began with a confident assertion from his partner. Socrates would then ask a series of seemingly simple questions, securing agreement on related premises that would ultimately reveal a logical contradiction in the original belief. This was often deeply humiliating for his subjects, not because Socrates was openly mocking them, but because the process forced them to confront the shaky, unstable foundations of their most cherished convictions. He was showing them, and everyone listening, that their intellectual scaffolding was often nothing more than unexamined opinion and second-hand belief. This was a stark contrast to the sophists, traveling teachers who charged hefty fees to teach the art of rhetoric how to make arguments to win debates, regardless of the truth. Socrates charged no money and claimed to teach nothing, seeking only truth. 3 beliefs that rocked Athens. Through his relentless questioning, Socrates arrived at a set of radical beliefs that challenged the very core of conventional Athenian society. First was the famous Socratic paradox that virtue is knowledge. He argued that no one willingly or knowingly does wrong. When people act badly, be it with cruelty, injustice, or cowardice, they do so not out of a desire for evil, but out of sheer ignorance about what is truly good for their soul. If one truly and completely knew what the good was, they would inevitably, naturally choose it. This revolutionary idea implied that the path to a moral life was not through punishment, but through self-examination and the constant pursuit of wisdom. Second, he preached that one must care for the soul above all else. Wealth, status, reputation, and physical appearance were, in his view, fleeting and superficial decorations. The true, essential project of a human life was the cultivation of one's inner self, one's moral character. Goodness does not come from wealth, he would say, but from goodness comes wealth. Finally, and most famously, he declared that the unexamined life is not worth living. For Socrates, a life lived on autopilot, guided by unthinking habit and popular opinion, was a life devoid of true human value and purpose. It was a direct and deeply uncomfortable challenge to every Athenian coasting on tradition and inherited certainties. The clouds gather Socrates' eccentric public profile and his habit of embarrassing powerful men made him an easy target for ridicule. The great comic playwright Aristophanes mercilessly caricatured him in his popular play, The Clouds. In the play, Socrates is portrayed as the bizarre master of a thinkery, a fraudulent school where students are taught how to make weak arguments appear strong and how to talk their way out of paying their debts. The Socrates of the play absurdly floats in a basket to better study celestial phenomena, pontificates about the measurements of gnats' feet, and is presented as a blend of an esoteric natural philosopher and a morally bankrupt sophist. The caricature was a hit, and it stuck. Damaging rumors began to circulate that Socrates was an atheist who denied the traditional gods, and far more dangerously, that he was teaching the youth of Athens to question all authority and disrespect their elders. His public reputation was further poisoned by his association with two of Athens' most infamous and despised political figures, Alcibiades and Critias. Critias, his former pupil, was the most brutal and bloodthirsty leader of the monstrous 30 tyrants. Alcibiades was a brilliant but reckless and self-serving general who had betrayed Athens during the Peloponnesian War. The fact that both of these notorious men had been in Socrates' intellectual circle created a powerful and damning narrative of guilt by association. The trial. In 399 BCE, Socrates, now 70 years old, was formally charged and brought to trial. The accusers were a trio representing different interest groups Socrates had offended: Meletus, a young and largely unknown poet; Anytus, a powerful and wealthy politician angry on behalf of the craftsmen and politicians; and Lycon, an orator. The accusations were twofold: impiety, not believing in the gods of the state but introducing new divinities, and corrupting the youth. Standing before a massive jury of 501 of his fellow citizens, Socrates delivered a defense, not of defiance, but of profound and unwavering integrity. As recorded by Plato in the Apology, he did not deny that he had been an uncomfortable critic of his society. Instead, he characterized himself as a gadfly, a stinging insect sent by the god to awaken the large, sluggish horse that was the Athenian state. He explained his entire life's work not as a personal whim, but as a divine mission, a sacred service to the city and its people. When offered the chance to propose an exile or to simply cease his public questioning in exchange for his freedom, he refused, stating that he would obey the god rather than them, and would never stop practicing philosophy. The jury, by a narrow margin, voted to convict him. When it came time in the second phase of the trial to propose a penalty, the prosecution asked for death. Socrates, with characteristic irony, suggested that for his great services to Athens, he should be rewarded with free meals for life at the public's expense, an honor reserved for Olympic champions. The jury, deeply insulted by his apparent lack of contrition, voted for the prosecution's recommended sentence by a much larger margin: death. The last day. Due to a long-standing annual religious mission to the sacred island of Delos, all state executions were forbidden for a month, so Socrates remained in a light security prison. During this time, his wealthy and influential friends, led by the devoted Crito, arranged a detailed and viable escape plan. Socrates, however, calmly refused. As chronicled in Plato's dialogue, Crito, he argued that he had lived his entire 70 years under the protection and benefit of Athens' laws. To flee now, as an old man, would be to betray the very principles of justice and social contract he had spent his life examining and defending. It would be an injustice to the state. His final day, as chronicled in Plato's Phaedo, was not spent in fear or regret, but in serene, far-reaching philosophical conversation with his friends about the immortality of the soul. He met his impending death with the same calm and reasoned inquiry with which he had met every aspect of his life. At sunset, the jailer, who had grown fond of him, tearfully brought the cup of hemlock. Socrates took it without trembling, made a light joke, and drank the poison as if it were a glass of wine. He was instructed to walk around until his legs felt heavy. He lay down, and as the cold numbness spread upwards from his feet, he offered his last cryptic words. "Crito, we owe a rooster to Asclepius. Please, don't forget to pay the debt." Asclepius was the god of healing, and Socrates' final statement has been widely interpreted as a profound metaphor. Death was the ultimate cure for the sickness of life. Legacy in a voiceless echo. Socrates himself never wrote a single word, leaving behind no texts of his own. Yet, the entirety of the Western philosophical tradition that followed is often described as a series of footnotes to Plato's dialogues about him. His intellectual DNA can be traced through his student, Plato, and then to Plato's student, Aristotle, and from there to the Stoics, who revered his self-control and moral fortitude. His influence echoes through the Enlightenment, in the works of thinkers who championed reason and individual conscience. From the scientific method, which relies on rigorously questioning a hypothesis to eliminate falsehoods, to the foundations of modern psychotherapy, which encourages deep self-examination to improve one's life, the legacy of Socrates' unwavering commitment to inquiry is embedded in the very foundations of our world. The modern takeaway. In a world that increasingly prizes quick, simple answers and the performance of unwavering certainty, the Socratic legacy stands as a powerful and urgent counter-narrative. It champions the productive pause, the difficult and clarifying question, and the courageous admission of not knowing. It suggests that true understanding isn't found in shouting opinions louder or finding information that confirms what we already believe, but in the quiet and often deeply uncomfortable work of dismantling our own assumptions. The Socratic method reminds us that intellectual humility is not a sign of weakness, but the very starting point of all genuine wisdom. Mini deep dive. Was Socrates guilty? Legally speaking, Socrates was tried and convicted by a jury of his peers on formal charges of impiety and corrupting the youth. However, the trial was undeniably and deeply political, taking place in a city still traumatized by a lost war, a brutal oligarchy, and a shaky restoration of democracy. Socrates had become a convenient scapegoat, a public symbol of the unsettling intellectual currents, the questioning of tradition, the skepticism towards authority that many conservative Athenians believed had weakened their city from within. His accusers could point to his controversial associates like Critias and Alcibiades, and his relentless public interrogation of the city's leaders as clear evidence of his dangerous influence. Was he guilty of embarrassing the powerful and forcing them to confront their own ignorance? Unquestionably. Was he guilty of asking questions that were profoundly destabilizing to a fragile and frightened social order? From the perspective of his accusers and many of the jurors, yes. But in the court of history, he was convicted for his unwavering, uncompromising commitment to intellectual and moral freedom. Socrates in pop culture. Socrates has been resurrected time and again in popular culture, from the comically wise time-traveling philosopher in Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure to a source of sagely advice in video games and television shows. While these portrayals often capture a sliver of his inquisitive persona, they almost always present a sanitized, simplified version of the man. They celebrate his wisdom, but tend to shy away from the radical discomfort he caused and the ultimate, brutal price he paid for it. They feature the clever questions, but rarely the death sentence that followed. This enduring, if simplified presence in our culture speaks to our deep and lasting fascination with his figure, even as we collectively struggle with the most challenging aspects of his legacy, his absolute, principled refusal to choose silence over truth or life over integrity. 3 questions to take home. Socrates' legacy is not a set of doctrines to be memorized, but a method to be practiced. His life is an open invitation to turn the inquiry back upon ourselves. As we conclude, consider these 3 questions. First, what deeply held opinion of yours, one you feel absolutely certain about, might crumble under the weight of persistent, honest questioning? Second, when was the last time a single powerful question caused you to fundamentally change your perspective on an important issue? And finally, if you had only one day left to live, what essential conversation would you feel compelled to have? And what truth would you be most determined to understand before your time was up? Conclusion. Socrates demonstrated that wisdom is not a destination one arrives at, but an ongoing, often difficult process of inquiry. It is a muscle strengthened by the disciplined practice of questioning oneself and others, and by having the intellectual courage to voice 3 of the most difficult words in any language: I don't know. In our modern world, so often characterized by digital echo chambers and performative certainty, this Socratic ideal of intellectual humility feels more radical and more necessary than ever before. The act of genuine, open-ended questioning remains a risky venture, just as it was in ancient Athens. But it is also the most authentic, and perhaps the only path from entrenched opinion to genuine, hard-won insight.